Welcome to Voxiversity. I'm Vox Day. There are three fundamental pillars of Western civilization. One is the Greco-Roman philosophical and legal legacy. And this is where we get a lot of our ideas relating to law, to the material world, to how we think about things. It's where we derive a lot of our language.
Dude.
The second pillar is the European nations. The West did not develop in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. Western civilization is the civilization of the European nations and the colonies that those nations established, specifically the United States and Australia. The third component is Christianity. If you take away any of those three things, the civilization that you have is not Western civilization. And I would submit that if you look at the history of the West, it becomes clear that Christianity is the single most important pillar of the three.
God wills it!
Let's take a look at what Christianity did to the European nations and how it transformed them. If we look at the history of Julius Caesar, when he writes about the Germans, the cultures that he described are definitely not recognizable as Western cultures. He talks about how the Germans run around naked, the horrible practices of the British Druids, and the sacrifices that they would make to their gods. There are certainly elements of those pre-Western cultures that we still have today in Western civilization. There's no question of that. But they're relatively minor when you look at the impact of Christianity. And I think that one of the best ways that you can see this is if you look at what are described in the Bible as the fruits of the Spirit. I don't know if you've paid a lot of attention to the way that the Celtic tribes live, the Gauls, or the British. But if you do take a look at it, you will see none of those virtues were exhibited on a societal basis by any of those peoples. When you look at everything, from the idea that children have special value and should be protected.
If he'd been small or puny, or sickly or misshapen, he would have been discarded.
When you look at something as fundamentally basic as romantic love, these are things that did not exist in the same manner that we think of them in pre-Christian societies. And it's easy to see. I mean, this may sound ridiculous, but even something as basic as the idea that a woman can be raped is something that no other society actually morally condemns. To the extent that any society morally condemns it, it is on the basis of the Western influence on that culture. It doesn't matter whether you look at Buddhism, the laws of Hammurabi, whether you look at the Old Testament, Japanese society, Chinese society, Arab society. In all of those societies, the offense that was committed was not a moral one against the person or the individual integrity of the woman. It was a property crime. And the laws of those societies and those religions and those philosophies reflect that. I mean, again, I understand that this is probably a very foreign concept to you, but I assure you, look into it. If you doubt me, look into it. And what you'll see is that there's a fundamental difference that takes place as a result of the Christian influence on the European nations and on the Greco-Roman law and philosophy. And what that difference was the idea that the individual man, the individual woman, the individual child had an immortal soul that had intrinsic value beyond himself, beyond herself. The idea that the individual had an intrinsic value to God. And so that idea has been the basis of, literally thousands of our basic assumptions, beliefs, and values today. And that's something that comes predominantly, if not uniquely, from Christianity. But there's other areas too. Take, for example, science.
I love science. Seriously, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is the shit.
Now, a lot of people are under the mistaken impression that science and religion in general, and science and Christianity in particular, are intrinsically at war.
The war between science and religion is like one of the oldest wars between man ever.
But number one, that's not true historically.
Wrong.
Proved.
Number two, the opposite is true. Science is actually fundamentally dependent upon Christianity even today, even now. But first, let's address the historical issue. Most of the early scientists were Christians, men of the church. Richard Dawkins tries to dismiss this by saying, well, everyone was a Christian then. But that's not true. There were non-Christians all around the world. Why did the development take place in the Christian West?
All right, let's hear some theories about why this might be happening.
Christianity taught that the world was understandable. It was something that was created by a God who communicated with man. To understand the creation was to better understand the Creator. And that was one of the primary motivating forces for a lot of the men who made these incredible, important discoveries.
Yes, science!
I love science, seriously!
The reality is that the church and devoutly religious men funded nearly all of the early science performed until 1830. It wasn't until German companies began funding chemists that corporate funding of science for science's sake began. The important thing to keep in mind is that the French philosophers of the Enlightenment who created this idea that science was naturally antithetical to religion weren't actually necessarily intending to attack Christianity. They were opposed politically to the Catholic Church. Now, many of them, were atheists. Some of them, obviously did have their issues with Christianity per se. But the idea that being a Christian would somehow make it difficult for you to perform duties as a scientist, as people like Sam Harris try to insist today, would have struck them as nonsensical. I don't think that even Diderot, much less Voltaire, would ever have accepted that idea for a second. But now let's go to the more controversial thing that I just asserted. The idea that modern science depends on Christianity.
In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true.
A lot of people believe that science is a method of telling the truth.
If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong.
But it's not. That's a fundamental category error.
Is math related to science?
Science is just a method. It is not a truth-telling device.
A new study suggests hugging your dog is bad for your dog.
Science is intrinsically and fundamentally dependent upon the honesty and the integrity of the scientist. And right now, whether you realize it or not, science is in a major crisis. And the reason is that scientists have ceased to make use of their own famous scientific method. It's what's called the reproducibility crisis.
So you just have all of these exploratory studies out there that are taken as fact, that this is a scientific fact that's never actually been confirmed.
People who are actually going back and taking the trouble to try to reproduce the results that scientists are reporting as quote-unquote scientific fact are not able to reproduce it. In fact, the majority of the time, the results that are claimed in these peer-reviewed, professionally published papers in reputable journals are false. They cannot reproduce more than 50% of the published science that is tested. And this is the good stuff. And it gets worse. Nature did a poll in 2016. They surveyed 1,500 scientists. They found out that 70% of them were unable to reproduce experiments that other scientists had published. But even worse, 50% of them couldn't reproduce successfully their own experiments.
It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
So the idea that you're going to be able to rely upon a method that most of the time is inaccurate and false is ludicrous. When you're dealing with a secular scientist who has tremendous incentive to falsify results or to simply put a little thumb on the scale or to make sure that he finds the results that the people funding him want to find, you have a problem.
I mean, science will come up with some reason to put in the books, but in the end it'll be just a theory. I mean, we will fail to acknowledge that there are forces at work beyond our understanding.
No, I'm not saying that a scientist is necessarily going to, is any more likely to lie or cheat or falsify data than anyone else. But here's the thing. When you do not have a religious incentive to tell the truth, and you have a tremendous financial incentive to not tell the truth, can we really be surprised when these professional scientists find a way to fudge things just a little bit to make sure the results come out the way that gets them published, that gets them paid? So that's why we're seeing this crisis in science, is because we are seeing fewer Christians in science. Now, Christians lie. Christians sin.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
This is all true. But you cannot claim, logically or with a straight face, that it is unlikely for there to be a connection to removing this religious incentive to tell the truth, replacing it with a financial incentive to not tell the truth, and then discover magically that these scientists are not telling the truth. So now, this is not a conclusive case, I admit that. But I am simply pointing out that there is reason to believe that, contra the assumptions of those who believe that science and religion, that science and Christianity are at war, I submit that science needs Christianity, or at least something that serves as an adequate substitute in order to avert what we're seeing as the reproducibility crisis. The post-Christianity of the scientific community is one of the biggest dangers to science that exists today. This concludes the first part. Just wait till part 2. This is Voxiversity on Vox Day.